Maya, what are your questions on this?
Well, my questions start with why were 3 airplanes landing in El Salvador after a judge said turn them around? One was still on the ground in the United States, and it was because everyone has due process rights in this country, including people who are here who are for determinations about deportation, particularly in this circumstance. That's why we're having and seeing this back and forth with the court. And so the reason I ask that question is because when we hear what we're hearing that is in these court filings today, it seems to be another indication to say we do not have to be accountable to the court system for the check and balance it is to ensure that we're protecting rights and laws of people who are here in this country. I mean, because remember, there are allegations in this matter where the complaint says you didn't even have evidence that they're members of a gang, let alone having committed any crime or any opportunity to just be heard on whether any of that is true. Not to mention the fact that they've not only labeled them gangbangers without apparently, at least what we're hearing, necessarily sufficient evaluation of that, which is what the judge is trying to understand and why the judge said bring them back. But it's also that they sent them to a country not their own that already has substantial human rights violations against its own people. And the parade that we witnessed demonstrates why we need these checks and balances and why we have to make sure that the judge is being treated with the respect the Constitution demands.
So, Maya, what about the standing of the judge, of the judiciary, in something that the White House says is essentially foreign policy?
Well, there's no such thing as foreign policy means you get to violate the U.S. Constitution. That's simply not an argument that stands up in court if there's an allegation that that's what you have done. What they're really doing is saying we're going to try to find all the legal arguments we have to say that we are not accountable to you. There are many ways to deal with the content that might be serious, protected, and there's a way that the Department of Justice has done that in the past with courts if there's sensitive material. But right now, the primary question was, what evidence do you have to do what you did? I mean, that you didn't even allow the normal process. We've seen also, by the way, with a permanent legal resident, that we have seen someone sent to Louisiana to try to, allegedly trying to deny them some of that legal representation that they're lawfully entitled to. So the question is this administration playing by the rules or is it breaking them?
And Devlin, you have new reporting that White House lawyers have determined the Alien Enemies Act could also be used to allow federal agents to enter homes without a warrant?
Right. One of the very, consequential parts of that law, it's a very old law, is that it's really a wartime law, and it was really designed to, summarily arrest citizens of a country that we were at war with. The thing to remember is that there are already multiple avenues here where this law is being challenged in court. What the Trump administration is doing is being challenged in court. There's essentially 4 different tracks. And so no one I've talked to has said that they are about to conduct such searches, but they have decided among the senior leadership of the Justice Department that they can, if they choose to do warrantless entries, to look for people that fit their description of alien enemies.
Maya, and just on a kind of a broader picture, if this law, is essentially a wartime law, then is not Venezuela at war with the United States if the Trump administration is saying that Tren de Aragua, that is part of the Maduro regime, but I mean, wouldn't there be a requirement to declare war on
Well, this is exactly
Venezuela?
The point. We have no declaration of war with Venezuela. Plus, Tren de Aragua is a criminal ring, right? And we have lots of laws and processes on the books for dealing with criminals, including criminals who are from other countries. The idea that we would be using a law that is in such disrepute, because remember, the law what they are invoking is what this country used to inter the Japanese, and what even Chief Justice Roberts called concentration camps.
Yeah, it was also, I mean, it was used in World War I, it was used in World War II, there was the FDR
And it's been
issue.
discredited. I mean, even the majority of this court said that case law that actually found against a person who refused to allow the government to intern him, who is Japanese, has been historically overruled. That's not a judicial finding, but it is that much in disrepute because it was just an open door to all kinds of constitutional violations. What we're hearing now should disturb us deeply because who says you could have legal status in this country but have a national origin of another country and then be called an enemy of the state solely because you are Mexican or Venezuelan or Irish. There's no boundary here that's guarded with this kind of argument.
Devlin, I'm just curious because the president, in that executive order, when he announced it on Saturday, did specifically claim that Tren de Aragua was tied to the Maduro regime. But Devlin, then should there not be a second step which says, and therefore, Venezuela is at war with the United States? That is not what that executive order stated.
Right, and part of this is there's multiple steps here, right? Is there a declared war? Is there a state of war between the United States and a foreign country? If there are members of this gang part of that declared war? I think you have, and then the third prong of that is, are the people who were deported this way members of that gang? So that's three factual steps that may not stand up to scrutiny. And part of the reason why the judge is so intent on getting real answers from the administration is if he doesn't get those answers, how can he make a judgment as to whether, those conditions even apply here?
And Julia, the Tren de Aragua folks, I mean, these are as bad as you can get. This is a gang that clearly does have ties in no insignificant ways with the Maduro regime, or certainly elements of the Maduro regime.
Well, sure, yes. It began in Venezuela, and they have been really causing more of their harm in countries outside of Venezuela, but in South America, like Peru, like Chile, where they've been able to extort businesses. But I will say they're relatively new in the United States, and we were able to get more security assessments under the Biden administration up through the end of last year. They said they were still much smaller than MS-13. They looked at a number of crimes committed across the country. One of the most significant was a sex trafficking ring that was run out of Louisiana and then in 5 other states, basically involved about 35 people. But when you're looking at the totality of crimes across the United States,
they've killed people here, too.
And they've killed people here, too, and they've been responsible for murder. And the brother of Laken Riley was also responsible for that. I'm not trying to minimize what Tren de Aragua has done. I think it's just harder to connect that. And, Jose, I should also point out, while we're talking about the Alien Enemies Act, of course, that's what people are tying to that prison in El Salvador, because that was the first way that this administration decided to carry out the Alien Enemies Act. But what could still happen is you could continue to deport. In fact, we know this has been confirmed by a DHS spokeswoman to NBC. They can continue to deport immigrants who get final orders of deportation to El Salvador, regardless of their tie to Tren de Aragua, regardless of whether or not a judge ever lifts this temporary restraining order on the Alien Enemies Act. They can continue to use that place as a location for deportation. And so I think that's something that we should prepare for in case we see more of those videos emerge in the coming days or weeks, even though this order to stay the use of the Alien Enemies Act may remain intact.